You hear the term culture war everywhere, right? It feels like it's never ending. But what if one of its biggest, most intense phases has actually peaked? That is the pretty bold claim from writer Andrew Doyle in his book, The End of Woke. So we're going to unpack his whole thesis, take a look at the key arguments he's making about where things stand and, where we might be going from here.
Okay, but right off the bat, Doyle makes one thing really clear. The title? It's not a victory lap. He's not saying, hey, it's over, let's all go home. Not at all. What he is arguing is that a very specific kind of authoritarian impulse, what he calls wokeness, has started to lose its grip. The bigger ideological battle, that's still very much raging on. So, what exactly does he mean by woke? Well, in his view, this isn't some new modern grassroots thing. Not even close. He sees it as just the latest costume for a very old idea. That authoritarian impulse, that desire for top-down control that we've seen pop up again and again and again all throughout history. And that brings us to his first really big point. He argues this whole ideology was never something the public actually wanted. It wasn't a grassroots movement bubbling up from the people. Nope. Doyle's argument is that it's an elite belief system, something that was pushed from the top down onto a population that, frankly, was never really buying it.
And he says he's got the data to back this up. He points to studies from the More in Common initiative, which, get this, found that even when this ideology was at its absolute peak, it only had real, genuine support from about 8 to 10% of people. And that's in both the US and the UK. So, a tiny fraction of the population. What a perfect example of what he's talking about. He brings up the term Latinx. He points out that poll after poll showed that the vast majority of Hispanic people either didn't like the term or just flat out didn't use it. And yet, he argues, it was pushed really hard by activists who, as he puts it, basically felt they knew best for a community they weren't even listening to. And this is really the core of his argument. He's saying that, in his view, the whole thing became less about actually empowering marginalized groups and a lot more about a privileged class telling everyone else how to think and speak, whether they wanted to or not. Okay, so you're probably thinking, if this ideology never had widespread public support, how in the world did it get so powerful? Well, Doyle has an answer for that. He calls it the ideological capture of our major institutions.
His argument goes like this. A small but very determined minority managed to weave its worldview right into the fabric of society's most important pillars. We're talking about the media, law enforcement, universities, the arts, you name it. And by taking control of these institutions, they created this powerful illusion that everybody was on board, a consensus that, if you look at the data, just wasn't there. And to show that this has real-world consequences, Doyle points to a statistic out of the UK that is pretty staggering. A Freedom of Information request found that the police there were arresting around 12,000 people a year for offensive things they wrote online. Let that sink in. That's about 30 people every single day being arrested for speech. So how does something like that even happen? Well, Doyle points his finger at an unelected group called the College of Policing. He says they're the ones who trained officers to believe that part of their job was to police people's speech and even their thoughts. For him, this is a textbook case of an institution being captured by an ideology that's fundamentally anti-liberal. And what about the media? For that, he brings up how the BBC handled the WPATH files leak. Now, this was a huge medical story, a scandal really, all about gender-affirming care. But to cite how important it was, he points out that the BBC, the state broadcaster, just completely ignored it. And he believes that's because of an internal ideological veto on the story. So you put all this together, and it paints a picture of an ideology that had a really firm grip on things, right? And this is the entire point of Doyle's book. He believes that grip is now failing. He argues we've passed the high water mark. We've hit what he calls peak woke. Which, of course, brings up the big question. What's his proof? Why does he think the tide is actually turning? Well, Doyle points to a whole series of events, a cascade, really, mostly focused on gender ideology, which he thinks is the movement's weakest link. First, you had leaks like the WPATH files, which showed there were serious concerns from inside the field about gender-affirming care. Then, the big one in the UK, the Cass review came out and basically found a shocking lack of solid evidence for a lot of these medical practices on young people. And to top it off, a UK Supreme Court ruling came down that defines sex in the Equality Act as biological sex. For Doyle, this 1-2-3 punch was fatal. It completely undermined the movement's claims to have science and the law on its side. And it's not just that. He also argues that the corporate world is starting to wake up too. That huge, multi-billion-dollar diversity, equity, and inclusion industry, He claims it's now being seen less as a force for unity and more as what he calls a divisive and counterproductive racket. Okay, so if this ideology is on the way out, what comes next? What should replace it? Doyle's answer isn't some new, shiny ideology. It's actually a return to a much older one, classical liberalism, a system that he admits is really hard but absolutely essential. And he draws a really stark line between the two. He describes wokeism as utopian, right? It's always chasing a perfect world, and it's willing to censor anyone who gets in the way. But liberalism, in his view, is the total opposite. It starts by accepting that humans are flawed. It doesn't promise you a perfect utopia. What it does offer is a way to handle the messy, complicated, difficult business of living together in a free society. And that definition is really key to understanding his whole point. He sees liberalism not as a finished product with all the answers, but as a difficult, ongoing process, something that's been built up over centuries, and something that we constantly have to defend against that much easier, more tempting authoritarian impulse to just tell everyone what to do. He also really pushes back on this idea you sometimes hear that liberalism is somehow to blame for all this. He uses this great analogy. He says saying wokeness is the fault of liberalism is like saying divorce is the fault of marriage. It doesn't make sense. Instead, he argues it's what happens when we stop practicing those core liberal values, like free speech and open debate.
And all of this leads us to his final point, his big conclusion. Even if this one specific phase, woke, has peaked, Doyle is crystal clear that the struggle to keep a free society going is, well, it's never over.
And this is the fundamental takeaway from his book. He doesn't believe liberalism is our natural state of being. He argues that the authoritarian impulse, that urge to control, to censor, to force your views on others, that's the default setting for human nature. Freedom, liberty, those are hard-won achievements. They're not guaranteed, and you have to fight for them constantly. And he leaves us with a really tough question, maybe one that doesn't have an easy answer. If an ideological fever gets so intense that people are basically screaming at phantoms of their own imagination, fighting threats that aren't even real, how do you even begin to have a reasonable conversation? How does dialogue even start? It's a huge challenge, one that gets right to the heart of why we're so divided, and it's the final thought Doyle leaves us to wrestle with.